Late May 1945. Somewhere in the British occupation zone of northwest Germany, a field kitchen stands under canvas tarps, steam curling from blackened pots. The air smells of boiled vegetables and watery broth. A British army cook, sleeves rolled, apron stained, stirs a cauldron with a wooden ladle. His face is weathered, indifferent. He's done this 1,000 times. In front of him, a line forms. German women, prisoners of war. Auxiliaries from the Wehrmacht, the Helferinnen, signals operators, clerks, anti-aircraft crews. Their uniforms are dirty, torn at the seams. Their faces are gaunt, hollow eyes, clenched jaws. Some stare at the ground. Others watch the cook with the stillness of prey animals. They expect cruelty. They've been told what the British do. The cook ladles soup into a tin bowl, hands it to the first woman. She hesitates. Her fingers tremble as she takes it. Warm, real, no spit. No insult, no blow. She looks up at him. He nods toward the bread basket. She doesn't move. She can't believe her eyes. Behind her, another woman begins to cry. 3 weeks earlier, Adolf Hitler had put a bullet in his head. The Third Reich, which promised 1,000 years, collapsed in 12. By early May 1945, Germany was a shattered landscape. Cities reduced to rubble, factories silent, millions dead. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared military machine on earth, surrendered in pieces. Army Group B capitulated in the Ruhr. The Kriegsmarine scuttled its last U-boats. On May 7th, in a red schoolhouse in Reims, Germany signed unconditional surrender. But the war's end did not mean peace. It meant chaos. Across Europe, more than 11 million people were displaced. Refugees fled westward from the advancing Red Army. Slave laborers stumbled out of factories and farms. Concentration camp survivors wandered the roads, skeletal and silent. And prisoners of war, German soldiers, sailors, airmen, and auxiliaries, flooded into Allied hands by the hundreds of thousands. The British alone took in over 2 million. German POWs in the final months of the war. Among them were women, not combatants in the traditional sense, but integral to the Nazi war machine. The Kriegshelferinnen, war helpers. They operated radios, plotted aircraft movements, manned flak guns, drove trucks, sorted intelligence. By 1945, more than 500,000 German women had been mobilized into auxiliary roles. They wore uniforms. They swore oaths. They served the Reich. And now they were prisoners. They arrived at British camps exhausted, terrified, and brainwashed. For years, Joseph Goebbels's propaganda ministry had drilled one message into their minds. The Allies are monsters. The British bomb women and children. The Americans are gangsters. The Soviets are subhuman barbarians who rape and murder without mercy. If you are captured, expect no quarter. The British Army did not operate on vengeance. It operated on orders, and the orders were clear. Abide by the Geneva Convention. Even in May 1945, after 6 years of war, after the Blitz, after the discoveries at Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, the British military adhered to international law. Prisoners of war were to be fed, sheltered, and processed. They were not to be beaten, starved, or humiliated. The Royal Army Service Corps and military police units oversaw the camps. Rations were calculated. Medical officers inspected the sick. Rolls were taken. It was not kindness. It was discipline. But to the German POWs, it felt like a miracle. The camps themselves were makeshift. Abandoned barracks, requisitioned farms, tent cities erected in muddy fields, barbed wire fences, guard towers, rows of women sleeping on straw pallets or thin cots, latrines dug in the dirt. No privacy, no comfort, but also no mass executions, no systematic brutality. The British cooks worked from mobile field kitchens, churning out meals for thousands. Potato soup, turnip stew, bread when available, porridge, tea. The food was bland, institutional, barely enough, but it was food, and it was served without malice. For the German women, this was incomprehensible. They had been taught that the British were sadists, that Churchill was a war criminal who ordered the firebombing of Hamburg and Dresden out of pure hatred, that British soldiers would humiliate and degrade captured Germans, especially women. Some had heard whispered rumors, stories of what happened in the East, where Soviet troops showed no mercy. So when they lined up at that field kitchen, they braced for the worst. A slap, a shove. Rotten food thrown at their feet. Laughter. Contempt. Instead, they received a ladle of soup, a piece of bread, a tin cup of water, and the British cook, a man whose country they had bombed, whose comrades they had helped kill, looked at them with nothing. No rage, no pity, just the blank professionalism of a soldier doing his job. That emptiness was more shocking than any cruelty could have been. The propaganda machine versus reality for years. They had been told lies, not small lies, not half-truths, total fabrications, repeated until they became reality inside the mind. Joseph Goebbels understood propaganda better than almost anyone in history. He knew that fear was a tool, that repetition made fiction into fact, that if you controlled what people heard, you controlled what they believed. And so, from 1939 onward, the Nazi propaganda machine painted the Allies as existential threats. The British were depicted as colonial butchers, descendants of the empire that starved India and crushed the Boers. Churchill was a drunk, a warmonger, a man who reveled in the destruction of German cities. Newsreels showed burning buildings in Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, always framed as deliberate terror, never as retaliation for the Blitz. Rotterdam, or Coventry, German women were warned specifically. Posters, radio broadcasts, whispered instructions from officers. If the Allies capture you, they will humiliate you. They will treat you as criminals. The men will do worse. This was strategic. Goebbels wanted Germans to fear capture more than death, to fight harder, to never surrender. It worked. By 1945, many German soldiers and auxiliaries genuinely believed that falling into Allied hands meant torture or execution. Some chose suicide instead. Officers destroyed documents and burned evidence, expecting war crimes tribunals to be immediate and indiscriminate. Women hid their uniforms, pretended to be civilians, fled toward the British and American lines instead of the Soviets, because even the propaganda admitted the Western allies might be marginally less monstrous, but the propaganda didn't prepare them for what actually happened. When the first German women POWs were processed into British camps in April and May 1945, they arrived shaking. Some sobbed, others stood silent, rigid, waiting for the violence to begin. It didn't. Instead, they were registered, names taken, possessions inventoried. Medical checks performed by British doctors, mostly quick, professional, impersonal. Then they were assigned to barracks, given blankets, and told when the next meal would be. No beatings, no rape, no humiliation. And when the food came, a bowl of soup, a piece of bread, it shattered something inside them. One German woman, interviewed decades later, recalled the moment vividly. "I thought they would spit in it," she said. "I thought they would laugh and pour it on the ground. But the man just handed it to me, like I was a person." That dissonance between what she had been told and what she experienced was a crack in the wall, the beginning of deprogramming, the first quiet collapse of the Nazi worldview, the British military ethos and camp administration. The British cook didn't see himself as a liberator. He wasn't trying to prove a moral point. He was just doing his job. But that job was shaped by something deeper than orders. It was shaped by centuries of military tradition, by the unwritten codes of the British Army, and by a stubborn belief that civilization, even in war, meant maintaining standards. The British military had fought Napoleon, the Kaiser, and now Hitler. It had seen the worst of human brutality, and it had learned, over generations, that discipline was stronger than rage, that an army that descended into lawlessness became a mob, that treating prisoners humanely was not weakness, it was control. The Geneva Convention of 1929 codified these principles. Prisoners of war were to be protected from violence, intimidation, and public curiosity. They were to receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. They were to be allowed to write letters, practice their religion, and be repatriated when hostilities ended. Britain signed that treaty, and in May 1945, even after discovering the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps, the British Army held to it, not because every soldier agreed. Many didn't. Some wanted revenge. Some muttered bitterly as they handed out rations to Germans who had cheered when London burned. But the structure held. Officers enforced the rules. Military police monitored the camps. Cooks served the meals. Medics treated the sick. The system was designed to remove personal emotion from the equation. This was particularly important when dealing with female POWs. The presence of German women in military custody created complications. There were concerns about fraternization, about accusations of misconduct, about the optics of British soldiers guarding women who had served the Reich. So the camps were run with rigid formality. Female prisoners were kept separate from male POWs when possible. British officers assigned to oversee them were instructed to maintain professional distance. Rations were distributed on schedule. Roll calls conducted without fanfare. And the cooks, men like the one stirring soup in that field kitchen, followed their orders without deviation. Some of them had lost friends in the war. Some had seen their hometowns bombed. Some had walked through Bergen-Belsen and seen what the Nazis were capable of. But when they ladled soup into a bowl and handed it to a German prisoner, they did it the same way every time. No speech, no sermon, no cruelty, just the soup. It was, in its own way, an act of defiance. Not against the Germans, but against the idea that war had to destroy everything, even the rules that separated soldiers from savages. And for the German women standing in that line, holding that warm tin bowl, it was the first time in months, maybe years, that they had been treated as human beings instead of cogs in a machine. They didn't understand it yet, but they felt it, and that feeling would stay with them long after the war ended. The first woman in line took the bowl with both hands. She stared into it. Steam rose into her face. Bits of potato floated in thin broth. A carrot, a scrap of onion, nothing remarkable, nothing generous, just soup. But her hands were shaking. She looked up at the British cook. He didn't meet her eyes. He was already turning to fill the next bowl. Routine, mechanical, indifferent. She wanted to say something. Thank you, or maybe why. But her throat was tight. She stepped aside, clutching the bowl like it might vanish. The second woman approached. Older, thin. Her uniform jacket hung loose on her frame. She had been a telephone operator in Dusseldorf before the war, a clerk in the Luftwaffe communications office after. She had never fired a weapon, never harmed anyone directly. But she had believed. She had trusted the Führer, trusted the Reich, trusted the promises that Germany was fighting for survival. And she had been told, repeatedly, insistently, that the British were cruel. The cook handed her a bowl. She froze. He gestured toward the bread. She didn't move. He said something in English, probably, "Take one," but she didn't understand the words. She understood the gesture. She took a piece of bread, and then, quietly, she began to cry. Not sobs, just tears running down her face. Silent, uncontrollable. She stepped out of line, still holding the bowl, and sat on the ground. The soup trembled in her hands. Another woman, a young one, maybe 19, watched this happen. She was next in line. She had prepared herself. She had decided she would endure whatever came, insults, slaps, maybe worse. She had heard the stories. She had steeled herself. But now she saw the soup, the bread, the crying woman, and she didn't know what to do. The cook kept serving. Bowl after bowl, woman after woman. The line moved slowly. Some took the food quickly, heads down, and hurried away. Others hesitated, suspicious, waiting for the catch. A few refused to eat at first, convinced it was poisoned or a trick, some cruel game before the real punishment began. But hunger won. It always does. One by one, they ate. And as they did, something shifted in the camp. Whispers spread through the rows of tents and barracks. They're feeding us. Real food, no tricks. Women who had been too afraid to approach the kitchen began to emerge. They formed the line. They watched the British soldiers warily. But they came. A young private stood guard nearby, rifle slung over his shoulder. He was 22, from Manchester. He had landed in Normandy on D-Day +3. He had fought through Caen, the Falaise pocket, across the Rhine. He had seen his friends die. He had seen what the SS did to captured paratroopers, and now he was watching German women cry over soup. He didn't know how to feel about it. Part of him wanted to feel nothing. They were the enemy. They had served Hitler. They had cheered when the Luftwaffe flew over London. Why should he care if they cried? But another part of him, the part that remembered his mother, his sister, the girl he'd kissed before shipping out, saw them as people. Tired, scared, broken. He turned away and lit a cigarette. Inside the camp, the older woman who had cried was now eating, slowly, carefully. The soup was lukewarm by now, but she didn't care. She ate every drop. She held the bread in her lap like a treasure. Another woman sat beside her. "Is it real?" she whispered in German. The older woman nodded. "It's real." But why? She had no answer. Across the camp, a British medical officer made his rounds. He stopped at a tent where a German woman lay feverish, shivering under a thin blanket. He checked her pulse, ordered an orderly to bring water and aspirin. He didn't speak German. She didn't speak English. But he treated her anyway, because that was the job. By evening, the word had spread to every corner of the camp. The British were not torturers. They were not executioners. They were soldiers following rules, And for the German women, raised on propaganda, drowning in fear, this was the moment the lie broke. Not all at once. Not completely, but enough to crack the armor. Enough to let the truth seep in. The camps did not become comfortable. They were still prison camps. Barbed wire, guards, roll calls at dawn, cold nights under insufficient blankets, boredom, uncertainty. The gnawing question, when will we go home? But the brutality they had been promised never came. Days turned into weeks. The routine solidified. Morning rations, afternoon work details, laundry, cleaning, sorting supplies, evening meals, lights out. The British ran the camps with bureaucratic efficiency. Paperwork, inspections, medical checks, letters home when the postal system allowed. The German women adapted. Slowly, cautiously. Some began to speak broken English. A few words learned from guards. Water, toilet, thank you. The guards, in turn, learned a few German phrases. Not out of friendship, most kept their distance, but out of necessity. Communication made things easier. Occasionally, tension flared. A prisoner accused of hoarding food. A fight over a stolen blanket. A woman caught trying to escape. But these incidents were handled through procedure. Punishment meant loss of privileges, isolation, extra duties. Not violence. The food remained basic. Soup, porridge, bread, sometimes tinned meat or vegetables from British Army rations. It was monotonous, barely enough to stave off hunger. But it was regular, predictable, and crucially, it was the same food the British soldiers ate. That mattered more than the prisoners realized at first. Years later, historians would interview German women who had been held in British POW camps. Almost all of them mentioned the food, not because it was good, it wasn't, but because it was fair. One woman, a former radio operator named Hannelore, recalled, "We expected to be starved. We thought they would feed us scraps, garbage, the worst of everything. But they didn't. It wasn't much, but it was the same as what their own men received. That told us something. It told them that the propaganda had been a lie, not just exaggerated, completely false. The British were not savages. They were not motivated by racial hatred or sadistic cruelty. They were exhausted, disciplined soldiers enforcing the terms of surrender, and that realization, quiet, incremental, uncomfortable, was the beginning of something else. Denazification. By summer 1945, the British held more than 2 million German POWs across their occupation zones. The logistics were staggering: housing, food, sanitation, medical care, processing, repatriation. The female prisoners were a small fraction of that. Total, perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 women, classified as military auxiliaries, but they posed unique challenges. Many had families searching for them, children, elderly parents. The collapse of Germany's infrastructure meant communication was nearly impossible. Letters took months, if they arrived at all. The British established screening procedures, interviews, background checks, attempts to identify war criminals, SS members, hardcore Nazi Party officials. Most of the women passed quickly. They were clerks, typists, telephone operators, low-level functionaries. They were processed, documented, and placed on repatriation lists. By late 1945 and into 1946, they began going home. Home to a Germany that no longer existed. The cities were rubble. The economy was destroyed. Millions of men were dead or missing. The country was divided into occupation zones: British, American, French, Soviet. Ration cards, black markets. Desperation. But the women who had been held in British camps carried something with them. A story. A memory. They told their families, "The British fed us. They didn't harm us." The propaganda was a lie. This was not universal. Some remained bitter, clinging to Nazi ideology even in defeat. Others blamed the Allies for Germany's destruction, unable or unwilling to confront the truth of what the Reich had done. But many, perhaps most, experienced a quiet shift in perspective. They had expected monsters and found soldiers. They had expected cruelty and found indifference. And that indifference, cold and impersonal as it was, had been more humane than anything they had been promised by their own leaders. Decades later, oral historians and researchers documented these testimonies. Women spoke carefully, reluctantly. Many still felt shame, not just for losing the war, but for having believed the lies in the first place. One woman, interviewed in the 1980s, said, "When I came home, my mother asked what they did to me. I told her they gave me soup. She didn't believe me. She thought I was hiding something. But that was the truth. They gave me soup." In the broader context of post-war Europe, the British treatment of German POWs stood in stark contrast to what happened in the East. Soviet camps were brutal. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners died from starvation, exposure, forced labor. Women captured by the Red Army faced systematic sexual violence. The difference was not accidental. It was policy. The British and the Americans chose to uphold the Geneva Convention even when it would have been easier, more emotionally satisfying, to abandon it. That choice had consequences. It made reconciliation possible. It allowed West Germany to rebuild not just physically, but morally. It demonstrated that even in total war, civilization could survive. And it all started with something as simple as a bowl of soup. A bowl of soup is not a grand gesture. It doesn't end wars. It doesn't rebuild cities. It doesn't bring back the dead or undo the atrocities committed in the name of ideology. But it does something else, something quieter, and perhaps more enduring. It reminds people that they are still human. In May 1945, on a muddy field in northwest Germany, a British cook served soup to women who had been taught to hate him. He didn't do it out of compassion. He didn't do it to make a statement. He did it because those were his orders, and he was a soldier who followed orders. But the effect was the same. Those women, exhausted, terrified, brainwashed, received something they had not expected. Not kindness exactly, not forgiveness, just fairness, the bare minimum of human decency, applied without malice or exception. And that was enough to crack the foundation of everything they had been told. Propaganda is powerful. It can turn neighbor against neighbor, justify unspeakable cruelty, make ordinary people believe extraordinary lies. But it has one weakness. It cannot survive contact with reality. When those German women stood in line and received their soup, reality confronted propaganda, and propaganda lost. The lesson is not that the British were saints. They were not. The strategic bombing campaigns that leveled German cities killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The war was brutal on all sides. No one emerged with clean hands. But in the aftermath, in the grinding, unglamorous work of managing millions of prisoners, the British chose to follow the rules, not out of mercy, but out of discipline. And that discipline, That refusal to descend into vengeance created space for something fragile to survive. Humanity. Not the grand poetic kind, the small procedural kind, the kind that says, even when I hate you, even when you deserve punishment, I will still hand you a bowl of soup. Because the alternative is to become what we fought against. The women who lived through those camps carried that memory for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it, others didn't, but it shaped them. It shaped their children. It shaped, in tiny incremental ways, the post-war world. History remembers the battles, the generals, the turning points. But sometimes, history turns on a ladle of soup, and the quiet realization on both sides that even in the darkest moments, the line between civilization and chaos is thinner than we think and worth defending.